So very briefly, I'm just get us started. So topic of chat. So the issue is this Mishnah, right? So our Mishnah in the beginning of the parak added a very unique thing where a person a person says, Rabbi Yeshua, a person says to his friend, "This field that I'm on, this property, belonged to your father, and I bought it from him." Right? So you have no proof that it belonged to his father. There's no documentation, but I admit, or the person in the Mishnah admits that it belonged to the person's father, but that they purchased it without, again, no documentation for any of this. Rabbi Yeshua, who disagrees with earlier, as we learned in 2 days ago's daf, with Pesha Asar in some circumstances, agrees in this case, right? Or disagrees with Amigo, agrees with Pesha Asar, who Pesha Hitir. And so you get to keep the field, right? But if there are witnesses that it was the field of the other person's father, then you'd have to prove it according to Rabbi Yeshua. So the Mishnah, the Gemara today, yesterday's daf was understanding why we talk about the father, right? Why don't we just say it was your field, or just be a little weird that you forget about his field, but nonetheless, why we said father, and we said it was this very convoluted case where there was 2 years, like there's a hazakah, you live on the field for 3 years, 2 of them was during the father's lifetime, the father died, then the son took it over, or didn't know about it, but the son could have taken it over, and it was 1 more year, basically. Today, we ask why we don't have a different case. Now, it's a little strange to ask on a Mishnah, why didn't the Mishnah say a different case, right? Because why should it say a different case? But let's see the cases, and then I think it might be a little clearer. Ask the Gemara top line now, Yudchat Amud Aleph. Last word. The litany, why don't we have a different case in our Mishnah? Why don't we teach? Moder Rabbi Yoshua, which is again the start, instead of a case of fields, of property, which is, and probably the reason is that it's much less common, right? People did not have a lot of property, not sell a lot of property, and usually you knew whose property belonged to someone. It's a little hard to forget about property. Right? It's a pretty unusual case. But money, of course, is borrowed all the time, and it's done, in a much less formal way. So why did Rabbi Yeshua common of borrowing in the Mishnah, right? Where a person said, did I freeze there? I'm okay? Got me?
It froze for a second.
Okay. Let me know if I saw you guys froze too. So
you're a little choppy, but that's okay.
Let me stop my video. Maybe it'll be a little easier. Who's on the internet now? 1 second. Okay, you guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So let's say a person walks into Beit Din, right? And he says to his friend, or he just does it in public. He says to his friend, I borrowed $100 from you. You might have forgotten. And I paid you back. So thanks a lot for that. And the guy's like, well, wait a second. I don't really remember all of this, but I don't remember you paying me back, right? So says Rabbi Yeshua, if that was the case, I borrowed $100 from you, 100 mana, or mana. I paid you back. But that person has total belief. Right? So, sorry, why didn't he say that case? Because that's a case of Pesha Asar, Hua Pesha Hiter. I admitted, I introduced the idea of borrowing money, and now I'm acknowledging that I paid it back. Says the Gemara, the reason we didn't say that case is Mishum Tekaboy the Mitni safe. Because then there's the flip side, which is if there are witnesses, then you're not believed. So what would the case be over here? Right? Let's say there were witnesses that in fact Ruvain, or the person speaking in the Mishnah, actually borrowed the money from the other person. And he came and said, it's true, I borrowed money. Fahu Amar Prativ, but I paid you back. So then the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yeshua says, Eino Ne'eman. Right? It's only if you're the one who initiated. But if there are witnesses, you're not believed. But that's not true. Because if a person even admits that they borrowed money, right, or has outside witnesses that prove that they borrowed money, and says, I paid it back, he's believed. So Kaimalan, because we paskin, we assume, Hamalvet Chavero be'edim, that even someone who borrows money with witnesses, again, without a shtar, so this is not true about a document, but with witnesses, Eino tzarich lefaro be'edim. The fact that you don't have to pay back with witnesses, meaning the fact that someone borrows money with 2 witnesses who saw it, doesn't mean that you have to have witnesses that you paid it back. You can pay back in private, right? And so the fact that there are witnesses that say that this person borrowed money does not mean that when he comes and says, I paid it back, he's not believed. So that's why we can't say that case in our Mishnah, because in fact, he would be believed. So ask the Gemara, what about a different case? What about the case, and this gets into a whole new exciting concept that we have not had yet, that is familiar though to most people, of modeh b'miksat. What about a case where you admit to owing part of the money? let's say the person comes in and he says, your father, Omer lechaviro, manela avicha biyadi, your father before he died gave me 100, mana, lent me all this money. The chaltiv pras, I paid back part of it, right? Meaning pras just means a portion. It doesn't matter what portion. Modem mixat could be anything, but I paid back part of it, and I owe you. So I paid back 50, and I owe you 50 more. Shehu ne'eman, right? That maybe that's what Rabbi Yeshua should be teaching us in the Mishnah. That in that case, you trust the person, even though usually the halacha is that you're not. Remember, there is a halacha based on the Torah, which I think is familiar to many people, but we're going to learn a lot about in Bava Metzia and in Shavuot, that a person who's modeh b'miksat ta'ana has to make a shvuah. It's a shvuah d'oraita, right? The Torah says that you make a shvuah if you admit to borrowing money, or someone has proof that you borrowed money, and you say you paid back part of it. So if you paid back part of it, then the way you resolve that disagreement, where I say I owe $50 and he says you owe $100, is by making a shvuah, right? And if you make the shvuah, you're putter, or from the part that you deny, and if you don't, you have to pay it. So maybe in this case, Rabbi Yeshua is telling us that you don't make a shvuah in this case, because since no one knew about this loan, right? The father's dead, there's no documentation. The fact that the person initiated the discussion means you don't make a shvuah. Says Gemara, well, that's a little bit complicated. It's not so simple, because who is it going according to? Aliba Daman, meaning who would Rabbi Yeshua, the Tana, which opinion would he be adopting? Aliba de Rabbanan. We're going to quote this in a second. If it's according to the Rabbanan say that when a person admits to owing money, they don't make a shvuah if there's no other proof that they owe that money. It's like a person returning a lost object. Rashi here adds some detail that there's a special takana that protects people who find things and return them prevents them from making a shvuah. Right, let's say I find a wallet, it's got $1,000 in it. I'm the really good person. I call the person up. I say, I found your wallet, here's $1,000, right? We were very worried that in those situations, the person who's lost the wallet could turn around and say, wait a second, thanks a lot for returning it, but it had $10,000 in it, right? Which is a pretty common scenario. What do you mean you found $1,000? What happened to the rest of the money? And so because of that, we're worried that people are not going to return things, right? Because you automatically are like, it's a very suspect thing. Like, why do I have your money? It looks a little bit questionable. And so people would be scared of looking like thieves. And so therefore they made a takana that if you can return something, no questions asked, right? No one's going to claim, there's no claim on you for what else might have been in that wallet or that bag or something. So this is very similar, right? Because essentially the father's dead. No one knows about the money. The person is essentially admitting to something and just take what you can get. You can't demand more. So that's the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov disagrees in a Braita, and he says that in fact you do need to make a shvuah even in this case. Hamash shvuah bai. Titania. What's that argument? What's that Braita? It's a Braita in really at the end of Shavuot, where Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, "Pa'amim she'adam nishpa al tanat atzmo." There are times where a person has to swear about essentially modeh b'miksat on his own claim, meaning he's the one who initiated the claim. He still has to swear through his own admission. There's no outside proof, Ketzad. And it's exactly the case that you wanted to add in our Mishnah. The case is, Manala avicha biyadi. Person says, your father gave me 100 a mana, and hachaltiv pras, I use some of it, but I owe him some of it. Harei zen mishpah. This person has to make a shvuah because basically they're modeh b'miksat. Even though they are the only one who initiated the claim, they have to pay. That's a case where you have to swear even though you are the one who initiated the ta'ana. And the Chachamim say, but that's not true. It's only as if you're meshiv aveda, because it's as if you found something that the son or the daughter has no claim, no knowledge of this thing whatsoever. And you're just basically returning, you only have to return what you can return. So therefore, our Mishnah can't be taking this case because there's a established machloket. It's not clear why Rabbi Yeshua would have one of these two opinions. That's the Gemara. Well, before we get back to our Mishnah.
It's like, I don't have to say anything, right? So he's getting the $50 that, right, he didn't even know about, right?
That's what the Chachamim say. What Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says is that this is similar to what the Torah says, and modeh b'miksat. The person who admits to part of what they owe is going to have to pay back.
Oh, And the Chachamim say you don't have to pay back anything?
No, you have to pay back. I mean, if you admit you owe $50, you got to pay the $50, but you don't have to pay anything extra.
What's the difference between the two opinions?
So according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, you have to swear about the other 50. Meaning, if you swear and say, I don't owe it, you're patur. And if you say, I don't want to make a shvuah, for as many people didn't, you have to pay.
Pay the part that you say you owe.
The other 50. That's it. So anyways, but I'm just pushing you off, Hanan, because the Gemara asks your question right now, right? Ask the Gemara, it doesn't make any sense. Why in the world, it's exactly the case of, as you call it, Pesha Asar, Pesha Hitir, or Migu, or as we call it, Meshiv Aveda. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Letle Meshiv Aveda Patur. Does anybody disagree with that? And Rashi says it can't be. Meaning it's a very established rule that if you're the one who initiates the claim, you basically find the wallet and go and return it. We're never going to ask you to pay more or even to swear that you should pay more. So how could Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov say you have to make a shvuah here? Says the Gemara, you're right. You can't. And in fact, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would never say that. So if I walked into a person's house and said, I borrowed $1 million from your father and I paid back half of it, and here's the rest of it, and the person gets very suspicious, right? You can never make a person make a shvuah for that. And the case here is Amarav b'to'ano katan. Here it's where the fact there is a claim. The child of this person who died came to court and said, my father told me before he died to go collect this $1 million from Joe, right? But he's a kid, he's 10 years old or something, right? So the question is, how do you view that? If he was an adult, if the man had come himself and said, so-and-so owes me $1 million, then that you might have had to make a shvuah. But what about when it's the kid? Says even if it's the kid, the principle is you never have to make a shvuah based on a claim from someone who's not considered to be what's called a bar dat, a person who has independent, let's say, knowledge. So a cheresh, shota, or a katan. Says you're right. When we say katan, we mean gadol. Right? My katan gadol. Says why are you calling him the katan? Because the gabe mili da aviv katanu, meaning he's an adult, this child who comes to court, but it's not his claim. He's saying, I heard from my father that someone owes him $1 million. So he's not really a katan, but meaning he's a minor in the sense that he's a secondhand kind of report, and we don't know. Do you trust him or not trust him?
Right? Don't we have a rule of ADP who don't take hearsay?
Correct. So you question. So it's one question. Is it's AMEP8, and this is a little bit closer than that because it's a relative maybe, but it's also because he initiated. Right. It's true. And he initiated the claim. Right. So here I'm trying the video again. So here is the case. There, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, even though he is not the father who's dead, and even though he's essentially a katan, meaning he's less than reliable source, because he can sort of know about his father's affairs, it's a pretty reasonable thing. We listen to him and we make the other person make a shvuah. And the Chachamim disagree. Okay? Says, well, that's fine, but Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov did not. Remember, the Mishnah, the Breita in Shavuot started by saying, sometimes a person swears based on their own testimony, right? But here it's not your own testimony, it's the kid of the parent's testimony. Yachi, what do you mean tanat atzmo? It's not your own testimony, it's tanat achirimi. Well, it's true, it's somebody else's claim. It's tanat achirim, but it's hoda'at atzmo. It's your own admission. That's ridiculous. Every single case of modeh b'miktzah is where someone else comes and says, you owe me $100, and I say, I owe you 50, right? Every kule tanata, every claim of modeh b'miktzah is tanat achirim v'hoda'at atzmo. That's always it, because if you deny everything, remember, there's no modeh b'miktzah. Ella, you know what? Hacha b'derabah k'miflagi. The argument here is about this very fascinating, thankfully we'll get to this many more times. This is just our first introduction as we go through Shas, of this principle of Rabbah. So now Rashi understands, this is a little bothered by Rashi, but Rashi understands that we're saying now that in fact the case is where there's a katan, in fact a real katan, and that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is actually claiming that if there is a minor coming to court and saying that my father told me he lent you $100,000. The guy says, sure, your father lent me money. I paid back most of it. Here's the extra, the last $10,000. That's the case where Eliezer ben Yaakov says you have to make a shvuah. And the Chachamim say it's meishiv aveda because it's a minor, there's no proof, and I could just walk away. So the fact that I admitted to something is just sort of kindness on my part. And that's based on Rabbah. What does Rabbah say? Damar Rabbah. Nipnei ma amrat Torah modeh b'mitzat hatana yishava. Again, it's a principle in Torah. Torah says, we'll learn from the Psukim later, not in this Masechet, but we'll learn eventually from the Psukim, that a person who says, I admit to some of a claim, has to pay. That's based on the Torah, the whole parsha of Shavua, right? That comes out in one of the parshas of Shavua. However, Rabbah gives a reason for that, right? It gets very tricky here, giving reasons for the Torah. What is Rabbah's reason? Rabbah has a very interesting psychological explanation. Why does the Torah say that Modem except Tana Yishava? Because Chazaka, we have a principle that is very well established and reliable, that Ein Adam Me'iz Panav B'fnei Bal Chova, that a person does not have the chutzpah to deny something that happened in front of someone else who's got to deal with. So that, and again, it's a little challenging to understand this, but that a person does not have the guts, maybe a reliable person who's not a known thief or whatever, to go to someone who lent him money and say, I absolutely deny that it happened. People do not deny to someone else's face. Now, if the person's dead, they might deny it to their child, which is what we're going to discuss, or deny it to court. But you won't stand up in front of someone who lent you money and deny it. Now, elsewhere, I don't think Rashi says it here, but elsewhere, Rashi adds a detail that's partly because you owe the person, right? Because they lent you $1,000 and you feel, a normal person, it's a chazakah, will not go and say and deny that happened. Tosas quotes it here, which is why I'm saying it. And so it's very bothered because Tosas says this also applies, of course, to Pikadon, right? Where you gave me a truck to watch, or truck's not a good example. You gave me 5 cows to watch, and I come back and say, well, here's your 3 cows, right? And so then the question is, I don't owe you anything. Actually, I did a favor for you. So Tosas elsewhere, again, Tosas quotes it here, but it's a discussion elsewhere about, it might not just be a loan, a favor. It's just people don't, if it's a fact, no one gets up and denies the facts. That's again, very, very generous reading of humanity. But that's the chazakah.
So this is the rationale for modem b'miktzat, or what? Uh-oh.
You're frozen again.
Okay, can you guys hear me again? Sorry, we froze.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm asking, what is this the rationale for? Modem b'miktzat, or?
So the question is, again, the Torah says that if a person, the halacha is, let me put it this way, if a person who walks over to someone else, goes to court and says, Joe borrowed $100 from me, I want it back. And Joe says, I don't know what you're talking about. You obviously don't have to pay. There's no proof of anything, right? But if Joe says, I borrowed $100, but I paid back 50, then you have to swear about the other 50. Midoraita. It's a Torah rule.
You have to swear about the 50 you paid or the 50 you owe?
The 50 you deny. No, so I'm sorry. I take it back. You didn't say you paid 50 in this case. You said I owe you 50. I don't owe you 100. So you admit that you owe 50. You're going to pay the 50. The question is, what about the remaining 50?
So which part do you have to swear that you only
owe? You have to pay
owe?
what you admit. There's no swearing about the 50 you owe or 20 or whatever you say. But whatever you deny, you have to swear. You have to say, I swear that I don't owe it to you. And if you can't make the shvuah, you have to pay the whole thing.
Okay, so you swear I don't owe you 100. That's the shvuah. And then you pay 50.
Correct.
Okay, because you don't have to swear on your admission.
Right.
You have
correct.
to
You just pay
swear on denial.
So the question that Rabbah is adding, Rabbah is giving a reason to this rule that's going to limit it. Rabbah says that the reason that we have this rule is that we accept as a chazakah that if a person says, I don't owe you money, we trust that they don't owe them money, right? Because we don't think that a person's going to lie and deny something. It's a chazakah, and that's not just lie. We think people lie all the time, but they won't lie to someone's face, is what we're saying, okay? To someone who knows the fact. And in fact, this person really wanted to deny, would have denied the entire thing. Instead of saying, I admit that I owe you $50, right? He would have said, I don't owe you anything. And the reason that he didn't deny the whole thing is misham dein adam meiz panafu. We think that a person can't deny the whole thing. So his admission to part of it is not very credible. because in fact we think that he is lying potentially about denying 50. The reason he's not denying the whole thing, right, is because we don't think someone has the guts to do that. Someone would not be so chutzpah to do that. However, now turn the page. Rashi, Ketosis here quotes Rashi in Baba Metzia. The problem then, of course, is what do you gain by asking him to make a shvua, right? Because if you think he's lying about owing the money, why doesn't he lie about the shvua, right? If he's going to lie about money, they can lie about swearing. Says, and this is Rashi's pshat again, Joseph quotes it here, doesn't like it, but ubekula boy delig. In fact, the fact that a person won't lie really means that he really meant to admit to everything, because people don't generally lie or steal money. It's a chazakah. But so he should have admitted and paid everything. Hai delo odile. The fact that he didn't is because he doesn't have the money and he's really stuck. He wants to get away from him. He can buy himself some time. And Savar, the person thinks, as everyone who owes money does, right? I'm going to get the money. My stocks are definitely going to go up next week, and I'm going to pay it back, right? So we don't really think that people want to steal. We think people want to pay back what they owe. They're not going to lie, right? Too much. But here, right, I don't have the guts, or this person doesn't have the guts to deny the whole thing happened. But they do admit to, or they will lie to deny part of it because they just don't have the money. But they have every intention of paying it back, right? Now, of course, good intentions don't mean that you're going to pay it back. So Rachmana Amar, therefore the Torah said, wait a second, Rami Shvua Aleh, let's make him make a Shvua. And obviously he's not going to lie in the Shvua, and so he's going to be Modeh B'kulei. So this is the rationale behind Modeh B'mitzat, which is that we don't think that a person would deny everything if he really owed money. And basically it means you lose your migo. Or your migo usually would be, I could have said I owe nothing. The fact that I admitted to owing part of it means that I'm telling the truth. And in fact, that's not the case, says Rob. Because people don't, if you really can't pay, what you would do is you would admit to part of it, right? Because you can't deny that it happened. You hope that maybe the guy will start doubting the number, right? Someone's be like, did I borrow that many eggs or that many? But at least you admitted it happened. You have every intention of paying it back, right? When you get the money. Torah says that's not really good enough. We don't want you to have every intention of paying it back. If you owe money, you should pay it back now. Make a shvua. And if you don't owe it, you'll make the shvua. But if you think you owe it, you're not going to make the shvua, and you're going to admit, and you're going to pay it all back. It says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, lo shnabbo, lo shnabivna, eno me'iz. A person feels bad about lying, whether it's to a person or their child, because that kid, the father lent me the money, or the father had a transaction with me, they feel bad about it. So the principle of Modeh B'mitzat applies to a son. And the Chachamim say, Rabbanan Savri, Bohu de'eno me'iz, avo b'bno me'iz. That a person doesn't want to stand up in front of someone who lent the money or had a transaction with him and deny it, but to their child, they don't mind doing that. And Mitolo is the fact that he didn't deny the entire thing, which he could have done, therefore, Meshiv Avedav. And so that's why there's a machloket. It's nothing to do back to our Mishnah, but that's why there's a machloket in Shavuot about whether the principle of Modeh B'mitzat applies to a child testifying on behalf of their father. Okay? So unrelated thing, very important concept of Modeh B'mitzat, very important concept of Heiz. Obviously things we're going to get to a lot. But this is a very common concept that comes up in questions of Mamonot about admitting Modeh B'mitzat. Okay?
But the comparison is to like the Ketubot, like she says, this was my first marriage, and he says, no, this was your second marriage or something, right? I mean, that's how we got to this?
That's how we got to this, correct. So this whole parak, or most of this parak, or the next Mishnah we're going to have in a second, refers to where basically this concept of Pesha Asar, Ruah Pesha Hitir, Validu, but basically where, there's debates about what's the facts, and the question is who do we rely on, and who's reliable.
Right. I mean, sometimes there'll be a shtar, right? I mean, if you loan somebody money, the idea is that you should get like a document, right?
That is the idea. It's a very good segue to the next mission. So, great. A lot of this happened because there's no proof, and you're relying on secondary facts, right? So remember, like yesterday's stuff.
Or something, or they never made one or something, or...
Yeah, they didn't have a shtar. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have the skill. There was a lot. The shtar was not a simple thing, right? It cost money. You had to hire a sofer.
I see.
Right? So, and there weren't a lot of people nearby, right? So I think there were a lot of limitations. It says our next Mishnah, let's get to Hanan's next case also. We're building an entity. You do have a shtar, okay? The problem with the shtar is the shtar alone is nothing, right? Anyone can write a shtar. You need witnesses for the shtar. So Ruvain, using our names as we like to use, shows up with the shtar. It says that Shimon owes him, $100,000, and it's signed by 2 witnesses, right? So now you've got to establish, are these witnesses reliable? Who are these witnesses? Did they really sign? So it's not enough to have a shtar. You have to, and this is also common, right? What if the witnesses die? So life is not so simple, right? Because you can have a shtar, but if you can't find the witnesses, that doesn't necessarily mean anything about the shtar, right? So let's say, says our Mishnah, Ha'edim Shamru, these witnesses come up. So now you have a shtar, the witnesses are there, they come into court and they say, Tav Yadenu, who's that? Yeah, in fact, this is our handwriting. We signed the shtar. Aval Anusim Hayu. You know what? Someone was holding a knife to my back. You can't see that in the shtar, right? I was being forced to do it. So it's not reliable. It didn't actually happen, right? I signed, but I was anus. Or Ktanim Hayinu. I was 10 years old. It was about 50 years ago, right? Or Psulei Edutayim, where I was pasul for Edut. That also is a little tricky. The simplest case is I was related, right? I used to be related to this guy. I'm no longer related, so I'd still be pasul for Edut. But the other case Rashi quotes is that he says, I used to run in a bad crowd. I used to be a thief, right? And so I was not reliable for Edut, which is tricky because you're not really allowed to call yourself a Rasha. But we're going to discuss this in the Gemara. But for whatever reason, they say, look, this is my signature, but it's not reliable. It says the Mishnah, Hare'elu Nemani. They're believed because they could have just said, we didn't sign it. Again, this raises more issues, which we're not going to deal with today, which is, what do you mean they could have said we didn't sign it? Why don't you force them to sign a piece of paper and check it, right? Can't you do that? So we don't talk about that. It's very interesting. But anyways, they are believed because they are basically the ones who said it's our signature. They could have denied the whole thing. They admitted it, but they gave another explanation. But however, in Yesh Eidim Shu Ketav Yadam, if you have external proof that it's their ketav, meaning there are witnesses, other witnesses who say it's their signature. Or you have a file, which is probably what they kept back in those days, right, of everybody's verified signatures, and this checks up, then the DNA matches, then they're not believed because they couldn't have denied the signature. The fact that they now added a detail is not a believable thing. They have to prove it. If you can't prove it, it's not believable. It says Rami Bar Chama in the Gemara, Lo Shanu, now we think he's talking about the second case. If there's proof from elsewhere that this is their signature, they're not believed. It says Rami Bar Chama, that's only if they say, Anusim Hayinu Machmot Mamon. That's only if they come and say, we were forced. What do you mean we were forced? We were under pressure because someone offered me $1 million to sign the shtar. So I took it. Then we don't believe them, right? Why don't we believe them? Because that makes you sound like a pretty bad guy. Why would you take money to lie, right? It's Russia. If I say my life was in danger, then they are believed because you're not saying I'm a Russia. You're saying, I was threatened by the government. I was threatened by whatever, by someone. Rashi adds a detail here. It has to be they were pretty bad guys, right? So they're dealing with the mafia here. Right, so if you're dealing with something that you're worried about your life, then you're believed. Because you're not making yourself into a Rasha. I'm like, Rava. I said, Rava, that's ridiculous. Oh, Kamine. I don't get it. You could just make up whatever you want, meaning you just listen to anything you say. Even the principle always is that once a person says testimony, they can't then qualify their testimony. You can't go to court on Monday and say, I saw so-and-so kill someone else, and then come back on Tuesday and say, oh, by the way, it was under these conditions. Right? You can't amend your testimony. You do it at the same time. You can't amend it. And that seems to be what you're doing. Now, maybe that's only true. That's only that if you say testimony by mouth, you can't then amend it. But if it's something that's in a shtar, that you can amend. Meaning, you don't actually know what the circumstances were, right? He didn't go up and say, I signed this loan, and then the next day come back and say, oh, I signed it under duress. Here, all you have is a shtar. And so the shtar says that I signed, which is true. I admit to that. But it doesn't give any information about the details. So maybe I could come later and provide detail that it was a very stressful situation and they had a gun to my head, right? Maybe you can. That's not the case. Because Amar Reish Lakish, this is a very, very important principle, Eidim hachtumim al hashtar. If you sign, and again, you have to verify that Eidim signed the shtar, it's naseh k'mishnach. it's as if the Beit Din verified that, and it's sort of a final testimony. So testimony on a shtar of writing, again, if it's verified that it's my signature, is just as good as me saying in front of Beit Din being checked out. And therefore, how could I come 10 years later, right, and say, it's true that I signed on the shtar, but I did it under duress? You wouldn't believe you. It's basically recanting or modifying your testimony. So you're right, says Mart. That's true. Rami Bar Chama said, Omar, El Iyitmar Areshet. Rami Bar Chama was referring to the first part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if there's no way to prove the testimony, the signature, and I come and say, yes, this is my signature, but I was under duress, Hare Elu Nemani, I am believed. And that's where Rami Bar Chama said, 1 second. That's only if you say, right? Nemani. If I come and say, I signed this, but my life was under duress, or not necessarily life, but I was being forced, right? Then I'm believed. Sorry, I said the line. If I come and say it's true that I signed it, but I signed it because someone offered me a bribe of $100, I'm not believed. Why? My time, because a person is not reliable to turn themselves into a rasha, and we don't basically believe you about yourself. You don't have you don't have reliable testimony to say that you're a rasha. Very complicated. Why? Why not? Right? So Rashi brings his beautiful principle here, which is, again, these are we discuss throughout the next couple of years, which is that a person is related to himself, right? So you're a karov to yourself. And so because you're related to yourself, you're basically not reliable to testify about yourself, right? Of course, there's other questions about what a person can do. But basically, we don't accept your testimony for the part that you're saying that you did this because you basically were unethical. And therefore, says Rami Bar Chama, we would not trust you. So we would believe your first part, that you said it's your signature. But we wouldn't believe your second part, that you say that you signed it under false pretenses because someone paid you off to do it.
What if you told a third party about it at the time that it happened? Would that third party actually be allowed to come and testify on their behalf that they're telling the truth?
So the short answer is probably not. It's very complicated, because if the third party was only told by you, it's secondary testimony. The third party was present, right? So if some other witnesses come now and say, we were there, we saw him sign, and we also saw the gun to his head, then they'd be believed. But if it's based on you telling them, then it's not. And again, it's really based on this principle of once you give testimony, you can't modify the testimony. And signing a shtar is the equivalent to giving testimony. So basically, by signing, verified, you testified this deal happened. You can't add details to it after the fact. Says the Gemara now, Tanu Rabbana, let's quote a Braita which is referring to our Mishnah. Right? Remember, our Mishnah said that if a person says, this is my handwriting, but I did it under duress, they are believed, right? Because essentially, apesha asar hu apesha. Says the Braita, it's not so simple. Tanu Rabbana. Says the Braita, Rabbi Meir claims, ein nemanim l'posle. In fact, they're not believed. Possible. Different Rabbi Meir. Meir disagrees with our Mishnah. It's an expansion on our Mishnah. Mishnah is just quoted the Chachamim and said you're believed. Says Rabbi Meir, you're not believed. You come and say, I signed it, it's my signature, but I was a minor, let's say, or I was being forced, or I was related, you're not believed. And the Chachamim say, Nemanim, you are believed, which is our Mishnah. Now, Bishlam al Rabbanan, I don't understand the right, says the Gemara. The Rabbanan, I understand Kitamai. The reason the Rabbanan that you trust this person is right? The one who said, this is my signature, is the one who can modify and say details about it. If I hadn't said anything about the signature, it would have no validity whatsoever. And so that's why I have the power to do this. El Rabbi Meir, my time. I don't understand according to Rabbi Meir, right? Why was Rabbi Meir say that you're not believed? You're believed to say it's your signature, you're not believed to modify it. So now, Bishlama, Shulei Edut, right? Now, one first case I would get, let's say the claim I make is, look, I signed this shtar, but I was a brother-in-law to the guy in the shtar, right? I was related to him. That is not believable. Why is it not believable? Because malve gufe meikar meitagdai. A person who's about to lend someone else $100,000 is aware of all these tricks. And they would investigate and look at the witnesses and be like, I understand, who are your relatives again? How reliable are you? And so basically there's a chazakah, a very strong chazakah, that a person doesn't lend money or hire witnesses or sign witnesses without checking it. So the fact that I'm coming 10 years later and saying I'm related goes against what we know to be true, goes against the chazakah, okay? So that's why Reb Meir says I disagree. And Ketanim Nami, the same thing is true about a minor. It's Kedr B'Shimon Lakish. Amaresh Lakish, top line. Chazakah, Inaydim Chotrim Al Shtar Ki Naseh Gadol. People never sign a shtar unless they know that it's done with, adults, meaning the same kind of principle, which is that there's basically a chazakah that a person doesn't do a shtar with inappropriate people, I guess, unless you have proof. But the chazakah, the assumption is that a person doesn't do that. Now, before I get to the last line that we're going to do today, the question, Tosfos here points out the very challenging question, which is that this is something we've been discussing, as you probably know, for the last couple of weeks, and we'll discuss again for many, many, many more weeks, is that essentially this is a classic case of a chazakah against a migo, right? Because the chazakah here is that it's a very strong chazakah that a person won't sign a shtar unless they know that the witnesses are good witnesses, right? So therefore, we assume that they're good witnesses. But there's a migo that basically nobody knows is my signature. And I walk into the court and say, this is my signature, but I was a puzzle witness. So you have a very straightforward case where there's a chazakah on one hand that people don't sign if they're puzzle, right? Not that they don't sign, but that don't lend money if the witnesses were not verified. And on the other hand, you have a witness who's the only source for verifying the shtar saying that I was a puzzle witness. And it seems very clearly from our Gemaras, from Rabbi Meir, is that you go with the migo over the chazakah. Sorry, the opposite. You go with the chazakah over the migo, and that's why Rabbi Meir rejects the migo, right? Now, the Chachamim disagree. So is that the reason the Chachamim disagree? Is that look at here, and this is a concept we've discussed a lot before, and we'll continue to discuss about chazakah and migo. So Tosfos just raises that point, top line. But that is the reason for Rabbi Meir. That he holds the chazakah is stronger than the migo. But what about the third case? On Nusi. What about if a person comes and says, there was a gun to my head, right? Remember, we just said it can't be mammon. It can't be where a person comes and says, I was bought off. I was paid $200 to sign this because so it must be a case where my life, again, it doesn't have to be necessarily death, but that's what we're assuming. Where I was afraid for my life if I didn't sign this. So why would Rabbi Meir disagree? Why would Rabbi Meir say, wait a second, you trust that he said he signed it, because what? He shouldn't have signed it, right? What's the argument? Says Rav Chisda, I'm going to stop here, but says Rav Chisda, the top line, Kasavar Rabbi Meir must be of the opinion that Edim Sha'amru Lahem, Chatmu Sheker, right? If you walk over to witnesses and someone says to them, sign something that's false, Al Tahargo, and we won't kill you, that Yahareg Val Yachtmu Sheker. They would have been killed over signing falsely. And so we assume, says Rabbi Meir, that in fact, even if someone put a gun to your head and said, sign this, you wouldn't have signed it. And so the fact that 20 years later you come and say, it's my signature, but I did it under duress, it's not believable. Because you wouldn't have done it. You're an upstanding, good person. You would have let them kill you rather than sign it. So tomorrow we're going to walk this back, just to be very clear. Partly because we're going to quote the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which says that there are three things that are Yarei Gaval Yavar, and this is not one of those three things.
Yeah,
so
that's
the
right.
Gemara is going to walk this back, and why it even thought this is something of much discussion. But either way, that's where we think right now. So that all Rabbi Meir is saying is that it's just not believable, and that although the Chachamim say you have a migo, Rabbi Meir basically is limiting the migo when there's a chazakah. When there's a real strong presumption against the migo, then he does not believe in the migo. So tomorrow we'll have to discuss a more rational explanation for why he's not believing this.
Right. But most people who sign a document are not doing it under duress. So maybe it's just,
I mean, again, clearly it was obviously much less common. This whole detail that you have to prove the witnesses are the witnesses adds a very big, important detail, right? If they die, you're really in trouble, just to be clear. And what you would need in that case would either be other witnesses who could testify they were the witnesses, right? It's a very long chain there. Or you have to have a document which shows their signature. So that, of course, solves all the issues, but clearly it was not so simple, right? Who's going to keep the document, et cetera? How do you do that? yes, having signatures is really not that hard. And we discussed this a little bit yesterday, which is that it was very hard in those days to do business with people outside of your own family, right? From Yehuda to Galil, meaning it was just the whole concept of having reliable documents across cities, across states, was very, very far-fetched.
Yeah.
For these reasons.
In Yirmiyahu, they talk about putting it in a container or something like that, right?
Right.
Like when he buys the field.
So, well, first of all, I would say that obviously was also a parable, just to be clear.
I understand.
But also, those are very central people, right? So this is you're dealing with the greatest. Maybe those are well-known people. It's signed documents, but so it's true. But it's definitely travel. But it's a good one for this week because it's the right story. I guess we'll pick it up from there tomorrow. Not me, but Dov, and I'll let you know about next Shabbat. Most likely I'll be away, but I'll be Sunday. But I will keep you posted. Okay.
Okay.
So
Shavua Tov. Thank you.